Hello and welcome to How to See Spiritually with me, Mark Vernon, a series on intuition and the eye of the soul. If you like the films, please do share them and feel free to make comments. I wanted to think in this episode about skepticism and doubt. And it's really very important, I think, because it's something that has become profoundly misunderstood in the modern world, in my view. Skepticism has become the enemy of a spiritual path rather than being seen as a key friend stage on the spiritual path. You get some sense of this when you think about the origins of the word skepticism. Nowadays, it tends to mean debunking other people's beliefs. So you have skeptical movements that go around showing particularly how religious and spiritual beliefs are wrong or confused. But originally the word didn't mean debunking other people's beliefs. It meant just simply inquiring and searching into your own beliefs. So skepticism originally wasn't about cutting things off, about policing what people could think, about disqualifying certain pursuits, particularly religious and spiritual pursuits. It actually was part and parcel of those pursuits, because it was about testing, discerning, inquiring, searching, trying yourself in order to develop your perception of things, and particularly this implicit inner perception of things. So it's a really important quality to embrace again in the spiritual path, and hence, wanting to talk a little bit about it. You might do that in many, many ways, but a good way, I think, is to think about the ancient Greek philosophers for whom skepticism and spiritual perception were intimately linked. It's there right at the heart of Socrates and the Socratic method, the ancient Greek, 5th, 4th century BC, who, if you know anything about him at all, you know that he went around asking questions, particularly about the things which we feel we know, we understand already. What is friendship? What is the good life? What is courage? What is poetry? And his point was to try to develop a capacity to ask the question, not be sure, and in that moment of not being sure, letting in a deeper perception of things, and so going on a kind of staged journey that actually opens up the subject by this method of doubt and by this method of uncertainty. It was called aporia by Plato, who structures many of his dialogues about Socrates around this notion of not knowing. Let me give you a little example which is often referred to these days. One of the dialogues that Plato wrote focuses around the question of what is good. We think we know what's good and what's bad, and yet the minute you try to ask, so what is good? How do you define it? It's not so clear. And in the dialogue that Plato wrote, Socrates discusses this and asks, is what's good what God says is good? Is somehow goodness and godliness somehow intimately connected? And then he thinks, well, how can that be the case? Because if what's good is what God says is good, and then what happens if God changes God's mind? What was bad one day might be good the next. And this doesn't feel quite right. That goodness feels like it has an inherent quality. It's got to remain the same. But then Socrates says, if it remains the same, then what about the gods? What role do the gods have in relation to goodness? Do the gods have to agree what is good, much as we have to try and work out what's good? In which case, why be a god? What does deity add to goodness? Although it feels like somehow godliness, goodness, deity, and this sense of supreme goodness, transcendent goodness, feel linked somehow too. So you're constantly asking questions about the relationship between godliness, between goodness, not to trash either notion, not to say, well, we can't say anything about what's good, we can't say anything about the gods, but in order to try and deepen and develop a better sense of how these two things are related. That I think was his task, and ultimately what it leads to is both a sense of we're not quite sure what we're talking about, although we feel pulled towards it. We feel we'd never come to the end of what the relationship between the gods and what's good might be. And yet, nonetheless, holding to that sense deepens our perception both of what's good and what might be divine. It's now said that somehow goodliness and godliness kind of coincide; they're part and parcel of the same thing. That would be the kind of end point. But I think Socrates wants to hold us back slightly from that and constantly ask these questions, this skeptical method to deepen our sense of things. Very different from just saying, oh, well, we've got that argument sorted. There can be no connection between what's good and what's divine, and therefore, we can just go off on a sort of secular path in relation to what's good. And we've got to wrestle with it a bit more and not give up. That was sort of Socrates' way of doing things. Now, he, of course, got into a lot of trouble for trying to hold on to the questioning and not letting people settle. Ultimately, he was put to death in 399 BC by the Athenian democracy, who couldn't tolerate his questioning anymore. So this is not an easy process to stick to. It feels much better to somehow know what you think. Say this is what's good in that particular case. But the trouble with that, if you do that, is it limits life. It settles on a particular view, and when it comes to spirituality, stops ever greater horizons opening up before you, which is the potential for the skeptical method. Others, modern skeptics, do it very differently, and perhaps the best known of these is Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist, actually sometimes called the French Socrates, because he asks questions not to close things down, but to constantly open things up. One of his best known examples, he asks the question, when I'm playing with my cat, is my cat playing with me? I think that I'm holding the ball of string in order to amuse the cat, but perhaps the cat is batting the ball of string to amuse me back. Now, the point for Montaigne was not that you'll ever really settle on this, but by holding open the question, by practicing this skepsis, this essaying, trying oneself, he wrote essays for this very reason. It constantly opens up the experience of playing with the cat. It develops it, it makes it fun on the one hand, but also makes you wonder, what is my relationship with this creature? What is this intimacy we're sharing? Is there a sort of soulful side to it? Is there even a spiritual side to it? It's skepticism used in that way that I think the ancient world was really onto, the medieval world was really onto, and we need to almost kind of claim back the notion of skepticism once again and make it part of the spiritual path, not the enemy of the spiritual path. Let me just develop it a little bit more, because there's another way in which it's used in Plato, and that is what's sometimes now known as proof by analogy. Now, proof by analogy is not the same as logical proof. It's a kind of way of making intimations, of wondering about parallels. It's about the harmonies and resonances which are so important in the spiritual path. What, as it were, is going on in my mind isn't isolated and disconnected, but somehow might be mirroring or opening me onto the mind which is inherent in all things, the life that's inherent in all things, this sense of soulfulness. And so what Plato suggested we do is think about something that we do know fairly well, and then see whether we can extend that to what we perhaps don't know quite so well. Not to get a completely tight fit, because he was very interested in the gaps, in the moments where our questions aren't quite answered. To coin the words of the famous song, because it's in the gaps that the light gets in, that our minds are opened actually and have a space to grow. So one example that he uses is he thinks about hot and cold, the relationship between hot and cold. And in one of his dialogues, he thinks it's not a symmetrical relationship, it feels like. Because, for example, you can say that heat is... I'll pick this again. He thinks about the analogy between hot and... He thinks about the relationship between hot and cold in one of his dialogues, and he starts to wonder about that, because when you think about it, the relationship between hot and cold isn't symmetrical. It's not that cold is the opposite of heat and heat is the opposite of cold. We even get a sense of this in language. So, for example, we can say that being cold is because we have a lack of heat, but we can't really say that being hot is a lack of coldness. That doesn't quite make sense. Being cold is certainly for a lack of heat, so we try and find some heat somewhere and take it in. But heat is not a lack of coldness, as if the coldness has somehow been taken away. So they have this asymmetric relationship. And then what Plato does is he wonders, well, look, maybe this says something about life, because life is clearly associated with warmth and heat. When we're alive, we sustain a body temperature. When we die, bodies cool. So maybe if heat and life are somehow associated, then maybe cold and death are somehow associated as well. But they're not the opposites of each other if they have the same relationship to hot and cold. That life is related to death, much like heat is related to cold. So you can say, for example, when you're alive, you know that there's death round and about. But you can't say when you're dead, there's life round and about. That doesn't seem to work. It feels like heat is prior, and so therefore maybe life is prior too, that life is at work and embrace death in the way that death can't embrace life. So this is a kind of analogy he uses to wonder about life and death from hot and cold. As it were, he grows out in his perception of things from a very everyday experience to a more spiritual sense of things as well. Some of the big questions like life and death. And for Socrates, I think this even went to the extent that when he himself came to die, when he came to drink the hemlock in 399 BC, he was so sure that life was bigger than death that he felt that death was just actually a transition that he was going through. It was a bit like a phase change, the ice melting and becoming water and then becoming steam. He too was going through a kind of phase change into a greater life. Something he discerned by analogy. Not a tight logical proof, but a sort of felt spiritual sense of things that could open up and he could become really very confident in, because it's in the slight bagginess of the argument that the deeper perception, the deeper light gets in. That, I hope, is another way in which skepticism, as a process of sort of searching and testing and questioning, inquiring, isn't a process of cutting things down, of debunking, of limiting life, but actually has completely the opposite effect and opens things up, makes you wonder, makes the inner eye, this eye of the soul, see things in a deeper way. Certainly it was very much at the basis of Plato's method. Religious people subsequently picked it up. In monotheistic traditions, for example, it's very common to use what's sometimes known as the negative way, that you can't quite see what God is, or say what God is, but you can say what God is not. So you can say God is definitely not mortal, so therefore God's immortal. You can say God's definitely not visible, therefore God's invisible. And the point about the negative comments, the invisible, the immortal, is that they hold the space for whatever that might be to start to touch you, to start to be perceived by you. And so it's a skeptical method. He's not this, he's not that, but used in order to hold open a possibility that spiritual perception can grow into. It's part of the spiritual path, not just in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Another path where it plays an enormous role actually is in the Sufi tradition. It's very, very common in Sufi practice to have sort of got a basis, a kind of spiritual development 101 kind of in place. You're doing your practices, you're a Muslim, you feel things are kind of going fine. And then suddenly something happens, you fall in love with a non-Muslim, or you find yourself having drunk a glass of wine one night. And these are the kind of stories which are told by the Sufi mystics. And it throws you into disarray, not only because what you thought was the steady, proven spiritual path has been compromised, but because the experience itself shatters everything you thought to be the case, particularly in an experience like love. It leaves you feeling bewildered, full of doubt, uncertainty. But this stage is seen as an absolutely crucial and fundamental stage to seeing God, because God has ultimately got to be beyond anything that you can fully grasp, that you can ultimately pin down in order to be God. Bewilderment, therefore, is built into the spiritual path. This kind of skepticism and doubt is built into the development in the Sufi tradition. So it's quite common, quite widespread amongst wisdom traditions, not just there in Plato, but there in monotheistic beliefs as well. The sense that skepticism doesn't cut things off. It's definitely not about trying to debunk other people's beliefs, but it's about testing your own beliefs in order that around the gaps, around the moments of uncertainty, new perceptions can come in. One final image which I hope would bring this together. The ancient skeptical school, founded after the death of Socrates, these searchers, these inquirers, they described life as being like living on the edge of a circle. And the art of living was to live on the edge of the circle, where inside the circle was what you know, what you can be more or less sure of, and outside the circle was what you don't know, what you're uncertain of. And the idea was to sort of live on the edge of the circle with one foot in what you know and one foot in what you don't know. And the point was that if you're the kind of person that wants to rush to the centre of the circle and have everything proven, everything tidied, everything sorted out, then life is going to be constrained. It's going to be just confined to the centre of the circle. But on the other hand, if you're the kind of person that wants to leap out into the unknown and accept more or less anything, to go with it in that way, you're going to be bewildered and bemused and uncertain without any discernment coming through, without your spirituality actually developing. So they argued, live on the edge of the circle, where you can be rooted in what you do know, but constantly open to what you don't know as well. And the nice thing about the image is that as the circle grows through life, as spiritual perception deepens, what comes in from the unknown to what is more familiar and can be related to, can be understood a bit more fully. As the circle grows, so the circumference enlarges, and contact with the unknown deepens too. That grows at the same time. So there's this sense that spirituality, using the skeptical method, is this constant process of expansion, constant process of growth, testing, inquiring, searching out, allowing yourself to doubt, to not be sure, in order that spiritual perception, seeing spiritually, can expand indefinitely towards the infinite, towards the divine.